to hearing from Tim. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Tim Forsman. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Mpumalanga in Cultural and Heritage Studies. And tonight he's going to be chatting to us about Thulamela, the capital of an ancient South African kingdom. His work was recently featured as part of a History Channel documentary, and we look forward to hearing about this remarkable site. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for the introduction, and thank you to the Western Cape Archaeology Society branch for having me chat this evening, to Lynn for contacting me, asking me to have a talk and giving me the freedom to talk about what I'd like to talk about. I think there are probably a few people, who are maybe a little bit familiar with the work that I've done in the past and have probably logged in to wonder what in the world is Tim doing at Thulamela. Traditionally, the work that I've been involved in is later Stone Age research, so working with hunter-gatherer pasts, excavating later Stone Age sites. But my interests are really the last 2,000 years, and they have been for a very long time. I'm interested in economies and how people interact and share and exchange goods, how people meet, where people meet, how those sort of processes unfold, and at least how we can tell that archaeologically speaking. And so moving kind of down the Limpopo River is in a sense, I'm still doing something very similar to what I have been doing in the manner that we're looking at people and these interactions. But this particular landscape is quite interesting because it's part of the corridor, the potential corridor of trade that's moving from the East African coastline into the Southern African interior, and importantly to Mapungubwe, which is a little further upriver along the Limpopo. And so initially shifting down into this northern Kruger Park region, I will show you maps shortly, was stimulated by this interest in what's happening in this trade corridor. And as you'll see tonight over the course of this talk, Thulamela is this fascinating site that we really know very little about. And so that kind of is the headline site of this region, and it's something that we're thinking about quite actively. So the title of my talk tonight is called Revisiting Thulamela, an Ancient Southern African Kingdom. Why we call it Revisiting Thulamela will become clear throughout this talk. But there are other members who are involved. Peter Delius, for example, is a historian from Wits University. Him and I are sort of spearheading the work up here, along with Lynelle Chewins as well. And there are other people such as Diogo de Oliveira, Decio Muyanga, and several others who are participating in this larger project as well. So this region is quite stunning. As you can see here in the image, this is a photograph taken on the Luvuvu River. The Luvuvu River is a beautiful part of Kruger National Park. It's a remarkable place, and I encourage everyone to visit it if you get a chance, or if you haven't visited it. It's absolutely beautiful. The bird life is quite spectacular. There's about 75% of the biodiversity of Kruger National Park occurs in this region, which is very high. A lot of people avoid the north, but as you can see by this image and some of the other images that are coming up, it's really quite something. It's quite a special place. And there's one thing about us archaeologists, and I think I probably speak for many archaeologists when I say this. A lot of why we do what we do is because we want to be in places like this. We are interested in the past. We want to work outdoors. We want to do our field work. So as soon as you arrive in a landscape like this and you have things like Pell's fishing isles, which, to be very honest with you, is the initial reason why I started working in this area, because I wanted to see a Pell's fishing isle. I hadn't seen one. And then I became interested in the archaeology. And I'm still looking for that Pell's fishing isle, just in case anyone's wondering. Peter saw one the other day, so I'll probably find a way to boot him off the project, purely out of jealousy. But no, I'm joking. I don't think I'll be able to do that. But I'll keep looking for the Pell's. When I find it, I'll wrap up the work at Thulamela and move on to another project, maybe where there's shoe bills exist or something. All right, so jokes aside, the talk I'm going to give today kind of has three parts to it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the recent history and context of Thulamela, because in the sort of the way we've characterized Thulamela and the way that the sort of motivations behind what we're doing up there, this recent history and context is really important. I'm also going to talk then about the archaeology of Thulamela. That'll sort of be the second half of the chat. And then finally, what comes next. And that feeds into the work that we're going to be doing primarily in the region, which we've started doing, and work that we'll slowly escalate over time. All right, so just to begin with, Thulamela occurs in Kruger National Park. Kruger National Park, I'm sure everyone's aware of it, has a particularly long history. It has a number of Stone Age sites from the earlier Stone Age, Middle Stone Age through to the later Stone Age. These are spread out along the entire reserve. And it was occupied by Iron Age farmer groups, at least from the 8th century onwards. There's some really exciting work coming up now from the Letaba region, and that's showing some really early trade networks that were taking place much earlier than we thought. And so there has been a long occupation of this particular region from the mid 1800s. After the trek, the Fur trekkers, you started to have the appearance of white settlers in the region, Louis Trichardt being a notable one, appearing in the 1830s. And then, but traders started to move into this region, at least from the 1940s. A very famous trader that many people are probably familiar with is João Albacini. From 1845, he started trading in the Kruger National Park region. He traded all the way, at stations at various different times, all the way up towards the Soutpansberg. And if you enter at Pabeni Gate into Kruger National Park, you can visit one of his old trading posts. In 1898, Paul Kruger declared this area a government reserve. He was convinced by a number of notable figures to do so, and initially it was called the Sabi Game Reserve, and extended from the Crocodile River to the Sabi. And so that's the map at the top left there. That's where you can see that grayish block. That's the early Kruger National, what became the Kruger National Park. In 1902, after...
Sorry, Tim, to interrupt. The slide hasn't changed to the map yet.
Has it not? Okay, let me just see. Just let me know if you can see the map now.
Yes, now I can see it.
There we go. Sorry about that. I think it's supposed to appear, so maybe there was something wrong with that. All right, okay. So in 1902, James Stevenson Hamilton was declared the first warden of this area, and following that, 1903, Harry Wooliter became the first, the following warden. And so these two are significant characters in Kruger Park's history. But at this stage in time, it wasn't a national park. It wasn't Kruger National Park yet. That was only came about in 1926 when the Sabi Nature Reserve and the Shingwedzi Game Reserve were combined. And then in 1929, it was declared a national park when the northern reaches of Kruger, what is now Kruger, were added to these two reserves. The first huts were only erected in 1928, and that was at Satara and Pretoriuskorp and Sabi River Bridge, which we know today as Skakuza. So this is kind of more or less a very brief history of the Kruger National Park. We did a really interesting tour the other day in Skakuza with the Mpumalanga Heritage Society, where we unpacked this in a lot more detail. But just to give you a very brief overview of what took place in this region. An important development was the train line through Kruger National Park. And they had a train tour that started in the mid-1920s called 9 from 9, I think was the name of the tour. Those were 9 nights that you would do on the train, stopping in various locations. And Stevenson Hamilton convinced them to stop at the Sabi River siding. So that was where Skakuza is. It was a very difficult sell because all the people in attendance wanted to do was shoot animals. And so and the idea was that it was a preserve. So they had to offer something different. So they'd stop over there at night, set up a campfire, listen to lions roar, hear stories from the wardens and from rangers, and then in the morning have a game drive or be shown around before getting back on the train and continuing outside of the reserve. And so that played a big role in establishing the park. But it did take a long time for roads, facilities, infrastructure, and other things to develop. I think hot water only appeared in the 1930s, and this was a big fight. James Stevenson Hamilton didn't want hot water in the reserve because it was what is it called, glamping. It would be too fancy to have hot water available in Kruger National Park. And obviously that's very different today now. But the area that we're going to look at is this part of the park, the northern part of Kruger National Park, known as the Pufuri region. Once again, if you haven't been up here, I really encourage you to go. It's absolutely fantastic. fantastic. Where it says Kruger National Park in this map, Patricia, if there's anything doesn't change, please just let me know, and then I can just make sure it's switched across. But where it says Kruger National Park is a sort of big belt of Mopani, and so a lot of people don't really push through the Mopani. People tend not to enjoy the Mopani Veld. But once you get down into the Luvuvu River floodplain, this entire landscape transforms itself, and it becomes pretty spectacular. But the reason I wanted to talk about the history of the Kruger National Park is because it very intimately ties into this history of this particular region. Well, it does obviously for the whole of Kruger National Park, but in the context of Thulamela, it really speaks to this region. And that's because of the Makuleke history. Makuleke are a Tsonga community of people that lived in the northern part of the park. They were in, I'll just quickly go back, they were in this green blotch, this northern part, so it's north of Luvuvu River and south of the Limpopo River. That was their territory, and that's where they lived. They settled there at some point in probably the 1800s, not exactly clear, but certainly by the 1830s they were there, because when some of the Voortrekkers moved through this northern region, they encountered the Makuleke, engaged in small skirmish contact, and then they continued south, and the Makuleke remained in the area. By 1912, when the park was, when there was a lot more activity taking place in the region, some villages were removed, or some people were removed from the Makuleke region. However, most of them returned because there was a lack of rangers patrolling this northern region of Kruger National Park. And that was until about 1929 when it was declared a national park and this entire span of Kruger was set in place. In 1933, the Department of Agriculture banned cloven-hooved animals in this region. At this time, the national park was not taking a keen liking to people living in these territories, and were finding ways of removing people, kind of, using nefarious means and methods. And this was one of them. Banning cloven-hooved animals is a serious problem when you're an agri-pastoralist and you have livestock. The motivation for this was to limit the spread of disease. And from one point of view, we can understand why that's important. However, it was also a convenient way of trying to get rid of agriculturalists from this territory. And so what the Makuleke did is they had their livestock destroyed, but they became donkey farmers in this region. The National Party, however, in 1969 forcibly removed the Makuleke. They were the last community to be removed from their traditional lands in South Africa. They were taken to a place called Nklaveni outside the national park. And there's a really emotive story that the Makuleke tell you when you visit the area. This is a quote from Livingston Makuleke, and I'll read it out to you. "There was no prior agreement or arrangement, no time to pack. Our fathers were in Johannesburg or working on the mines. It was only the women and children at home. This was a terrible tragedy in our lives. We lost our identity. We even lost our traditional leader. He was taken away to become a leader under another chief." If you visit the area, if you have visited there and you've heard the stories, the Makuleke lived, their main village where their chief lived is a place called Deku, named after a woman who joined the community from Mozambique. Her name was Deku. And while sitting in Deku, while present in the village, families came running up from the Luvuvu River while they're collecting water, saying the GGs are coming, the government vehicles. And very soon after that, a number of these vehicles arrived, killed livestock, threw people into the back of the vans. They collected whatever they could while they were being moved, and destroyed and burnt the village to the ground, shooting all of the dogs because they didn't want the dogs to continue living in Kruger National Park. This is a story that we hear, in many parts of South Africa. So from 1969, the Makuleke vacated the region. They were now living in Nklaveni, and they were no longer part of this particular landscape. This image here is an area called, I hope you can see it, I hope the graphic worked, or the transition, but this is a place called Lana Gorge. It's absolutely remarkable. It's a beautiful gorge with about an 80, 90 meter drop onto the Luvuvu River. It's an incredibly frustrating place because from that headland, that large meander on the left, from the headland sticking out there, when you stand on that rock on the very end of it, and you look into the river, you can see hippos and crocodiles, and incredibly, you can see a huge colony of fish living in the river. It's amazing from that high up, and all of those fish are tiger fish, and no one's allowed to fish there. It's So obviously, I'm very interested to know how tigerfish influence the archaeological record. So I'm probably going to have to go and catch some of them to determine that, but that'll be the next project, I think. So the region was known, there was archaeology in the area. It was known from the 1960s. Some early studies conducted in this particular area took place. Elof and Duval wrote a paper on Makahane. Now, Makahane is in Kruger National Park. It's along the Luvuvu River. It's about 14 kilometers from where I saw those beautiful tigerfish. Sorry, the site of Thulamela. It's upriver, and the idea behind Makahane is that it was part of it was occupied prior to Thulamela being occupied. However, as with many of the sites in the north, very limited work has actually taken place at them, and so we need to do a lot more before we can really be very certain of some of this. But that is the sort of going idea, is that Makahane predates Thulamela immediately, and that the people from Makahane possibly even moved across to Thulamela. But in the 1960s and in this part of the world, now keeping in mind that this is when national party policies were in place, people were being removed from these territories, Black history was not of particular interest to many people. And so, Elof and Duval, although recorded the site and mapped Makahane, very little happened after that. And it was part of this bigger drive, this narrative around the empty land myth, or what we call the empty land myth. And many, many sites in South Africa were victim to this, including sites like Mapungubwe, where the history of these sites was not being properly acknowledged because of these national party drives. And we still hear, every now and then we hear, I've seen certainly these pictures crop up on social media of a Dutch, I'm assuming the Haarlem ship arriving, and you see these chronologies of the Dutch arriving before Zulu, before the Xhosa, and so on. These narratives do pop up, and it links back into this empty land myth. The roots of these, or the root of that idea, comes from this empty land myth. So there was knowledge of sites, but it wasn't really followed up with considerable research. Most of the sites that are known from this area are Iron Age sites like Makahane. In the 1960s, Thulamela, people weren't aware of it, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But also there's a lot of Stone Age sites in the region, as well as some rock art sites, but not that many. I think, however, the reason we don't know of too many rock art sites, I'm just going to go back a slide, is largely because of what you're looking at right now. It's incredibly difficult to access this territory. Moving through that landscape, this is taken in summer, but moving through this landscape, looking in those cracks and crevices and in the kranzes, as you can imagine, is not very easy. We did it the other day. It took us an entire day to walk around 8-9 kilometers to try and find one site. It's difficult. And so I imagine there's probably a lot more out there. It's just a case of accessing it and finding it. That's the trouble. So this region, there are a number of sites that people knew about in the 60s, but not much work had been undertaken. And then in 1983, now I'd just like to give a proviso here. I've seen two dates for this, 1983 and 1986. It almost seems like these dates are used interchangeably, even by the same authors. So I'm not quite sure whether it was 1983 or it was 1986, but I've just said 1983 for now. So 1983, a park ranger, Philip Nell, kind of stumbled upon Thulamela. He reported it, and he tried to get some research, but not much happened initially. Now, what's interesting about the finding of Thulamela is that the name Thulamela was already known at that stage. So when Philip Nell found the site in the 1980s, that hill already had the name Thulamela, even though supposedly the site wasn't known of. So I suspect that this hill was probably known of by local communities, or at the very least, someone knew that it was an important place, whether they knew what was up there, perhaps they didn't, but they knew the hill had some significance, and so it had a name. But because I can't imagine, when you go into that region, there's hills all over the place. And this one hill was called Thulamela, and on it was this incredible site. It just seems too coincidental to me. But nonetheless, Philip Nels is reported to have found it in the 1980s. And it took several years. Again, I'm not exactly sure how many, because it depends whether it was 83 or 86, but it took several years for the National Culture and History Museum to begin working at Thulamela. So this is what's now the Ditsong Museum, or part of the Ditsong Museums. And they began working in 1990 at several sites, including Makahane, Thulamela, and another site called Majigwili. Machigwili is also known as Little Thulamela. And if you've been to Punda Maria and you've driven north towards the Luvuvu River, towards Pafuri, you would have, driving along the tar road, you would have passed it. It's quite close to the tar road, and it's quite a beautiful site, actually. It has a nice amount of stone walling with a large monolith in the middle of the site, or what conceivably would be near more or less the middle of the site. And then on the western side of this outcrop are two shelters. With rock art in, unfortunately, heavily faded. But there are two shelters very close to the site as well. One of the sites, the shelters, is a beloved buffalo hangout. So when you round the corner to enter the shelter, you do need to be careful, or you may end up locking horns with an animal that causes a lot of damage when it headbutts people. But it is a fantastic site in the region. So when they began excavating in Thulamela, they didn't quite know what was there. They obviously knew about this walling, and you'll see some photographs. You can see one in the background here. They knew about the walling. Based on that and the size of the site, they could tell that it was a site of significance, of some kind of significance. So they excavated in a midden. Now, what I mean by a midden is it's essentially a dump. So in these sites, in these Iron Age sites, you tend to find locations where people are aggregating their waste, dumping it in an area, and then putting ash on top of it. So you often find these grayish mounds. And that's what they found. They found several at Thulamela, but they dug in the largest one, and I'll show you where it is in a few slides' time. And they found some really interesting finds, some ceramics and a variety of other things. But what they did end up finding, which really piqued their interest, were 3 gold beads. 3 gold beads and a gold nugget. Now, this was unusual. Gold, we have found gold, or archaeologists have found gold at sites, Mapungubwe being one of the most notable sites in the region, but it's not a very common thing to find. So, and when one does find gold, from a modern perspective, from our value systems, these things were important, but in the past they were too, and they were traded towards the East African coastline for various forms of wealth. So this led to significant interest in Thulamela. The discovery of this gold in the early 1990s, and it garnered a lot of political interest, a lot of interest in the media, and Paulo Jordan, a member of the NEC at the time, gave a talk which he said, "Great Zimbabwe may be the most famous archaeological site in South Africa, but Thulamela is the most magical." And Thulamela was academically described, at least by one author, as the greatest archaeological site in South Africa. Now, I'm sure, obviously these are up for debate, but I think we can probably agree that it was a pretty impressive archaeological site nonetheless. Jordan's speech was titled Thulamela Excavation Proves Black Heritage. And this is what kind of scooped up Thulamela and ran with it, was this notion that whereas before, this history, this local history, indigenous history, was not fully being acknowledged, was not, and obviously by many archaeologists it was, but by the general media, by government officials and so on, it wasn't being fully acknowledged. It wasn't being heavily supported, and this empty land myth was perpetuated. But what came to be, as archaeologists began peeling back the layers of history on these particular landscapes, and when the sort of political will started opening doors for a lot more expansive research and conversations to be had in many more public spaces and so on, people started to realize the incredible history, as we know today, of these landscapes. And so Thulamela became a flagship site, as it was described by the national park, to showcase the incredible history of this region of South Africa, where there was incredible innovation, technological advancements, the establishment of these civilizations, of these large states, these important histories related to groups that are still around today. And Thulamela really got wrapped up in that, and it was it sort of everything exploded around the site in the sort of mid 1990s. Massive interest, a lot of keen eyes looking towards Thulamela about what would be found at this site. And South African national parks decided that as a flagship site, they would excavate it, but with the purpose primarily of rehabilitating the site. So they appointed an engineer, Sidney Miller. Sidney Miller had worked with the national parks for some time. He had worked on the Schoemansdal site, and he was also the individual who mapped Thulamela in the early 1990s with the National Museum. With his knowledge of architecture locally, he hired 10 masons, 5 from Venda and 5 from Tonga communities to assist him with the rehabilitation. And their plan was to clean the entire site, remove all of the rock collapse, and then figure out the coursing of the walls. So this is, when I say coursing, it's the kind of rock work in the walls, whether it's roughly coursed, so rocks packed on top of each other very loosely, or more finely coursed, like Great Zimbabwe, for example, where you get these nice beautiful rock layers where there's a lot of attention to detail and to establishing this beautiful kind of walled sequence. There are several different forms of walling, and they wanted to figure out which dominated the site, which appeared in certain areas, and then replicate that. They rebuilt about 350 meters of walls, and Sydney estimates he moved around 2,000 tons of rock. Now, that's pretty impressive. The hill's not easy to climb. It's not easy to navigate in some areas. So what they did was quite a remarkable feat. One afternoon, if you read Sydney's book published in, I forget the date, but he wrote a sort of memoir on his time at Thulamela. And in there, he recalls an afternoon after imbibing somewhat and feeling the need to ascend the hill and clear his mind slightly. And so he went up the hill with a trowel, and he sort of started walking around around the stone walled area. And he noticed, or he had previously noticed, but a depression in what he thought was a hut floor. And this typically happens, or can happen at least, when you do have a burial that then decays and it forms a cavity underground that collapses somewhat, creating a slight depression on the surface. And so he investigated this a little closely, and he uncovered human remains. So once he realized what he'd spotted, he immediately stopped. He approached the South African National Parks and what was called the Thulamela Committee. The Thulamela Committee was made up of several members of the local communities, Tsonga, Shangaan, and Venda communities, who were part of the Thulamela Committee, and they oversaw a lot of the work that was carried out. And so it was sort of a very kind of forward-thinking community engagement program, more so than many other studies had been by that time. But yeah, certainly not without its own issues. So he approached the committee. At the discovery of human remains, the committee became very interested. They were very concerned about the ancestors, about upsetting the ancestors, but also they were keenly aware of the removal of human remains in Southern Africa and South Africa. And they didn't want their ancestors to befall the same fate. And so there was a lot of discussion that took place between several stakeholders, including the Thulamela Committee. And they decided to excavate the human remains in one of the enclosures that he had found, which became known as UP43. It was excavated by the University of Pretoria Anatomy Department under the agreement that nothing would be removed from site other than a few samples that could then be dated and DNA could be established. And so they set up a lab on site, they removed the remains and then reburied them. However, while doing this, they found another burial, which they called UP44. This burial was in another enclosure. I'm going to show you some images in a short while. This was in another enclosure. It was a male. A UP43 is a female. It was a male, and these remains were removed from the site and then reburied later, 1997 or 8. They were reburied. But what also was really unique about these finds was that along with them was a trove of golden items. The female had a golden bracelet on her right wrist, but the male had a number of golden nuggets, beads, bangles, iron bangles with golden beads crimped onto the end of them. And there's about 2.5 kilos of gold that was found at the site, most of it coming from these two burials. So these burials became interesting to many people. People were interested in the human remains. People were very interested in the gold. And I think it's probably not unfair to say that it was to the detriment of all the other finds that were made around the site, which I'll show you images of and I'll show you the locations of shortly. Because the only papers, detailed papers in academic journals on the excavations that took place at Thulamela in the 90s are on the human remains and the gold. There is very little data, empirical evidence that's been presented in peer-reviewed papers on anything else that was found. And so this is pretty serious problem for Thulamela. As scientists, as archaeologists, we rely on evidence. We rely on quantifiable data, whether it be tangible or intangible, and we receive that evidence through the peer review process. This is how scholarship unfolds. And so when we talk about Thulamela in the papers that we write, we refer back to papers that have been written previously about what happened at the site, what was found, the stratigraphy, the chronology, the site layout. And this hasn't actually been presented. So a lot of what we say about Thulamela in many papers comes from a number of assumptions being made or comparisons being drawn between Thulamela and places like Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe and Venda ethnography. Now, it's not to say that this is necessarily incorrect, but we don't necessarily have the empirical evidence to support that largely. And this is quite an issue. But I'll get back to that in a moment. Unfortunately, after the human remains and the gold was discovered, Thulamela largely was forgotten. It became this far-off tourist site that not many people visit, that's, largely poorly managed, or has been at least for the last 30 years. It's far better now, certainly. If you go there presently, you'll find walls that have collapsed since the rebuilding that haven't been repaired. And a lot of this momentum and this interest in Thulamela, unfortunately, fell away. And so Thulamela is this incredible site that we haven't actually done much with, despite the fact that it has such incredible finds, despite the fact that it's so large, but also despite the fact that it's referenced so regularly in a number of papers produced around the Iron Age of Central Southern Africa. So what we are trying to do with our study is revisit Thulamela or re-engage Thulamela. There's a number of words, attractive words we can put at the head in front of this. But ultimately what we want to do is get back to the site, but also get back to the region. And I'll talk about the region at the very end. What I'm going to talk about now is what actually happened at this site in terms of the archaeology. What was done at Thulamela? What excavations took place? What was found actually at Thulamela? So here's a map of the site. Now, typically what you've seen so far, at least, and what you tend to see in photographs, on websites, in news articles, is that little area that's in that dashed box where it says primary occupation area. That's where most of the walling occurs. This is what Sidney Miller referred to as the Musonda, which is the area that the chief and the royal wives would have resided in, and possibly various other important people. When you ascend the hill, you appear just north of that block where you can see a kind of C-shaped dark line. That's a stone-walled area, possibly a kraal. There's a beautiful baobab right next to it. You come up right in front of that walled area. You then curve around the slope and you carry on walking up towards the sort of main area. However, this site is 9 hectares. So it's particularly large. It's not a small settlement, as I'm sure you probably would have imagined that it is quite big. Well, it is. There's walling all over the top of this hill. But the work that was carried out has all been done in this walled area. Now, that creates a kind of bias for us. The focus is in what appears to be the most interesting area, what probably, from one perspective at least, is the most interesting area. But there are a number of other locations that have evidence of occupation. There's other walled areas on top of the hill marked by these black streaks that you can see, the thick black streaks you can see on the screen. These are other walled areas. The one at the very bottom of the image, where you can see an upside down U shape with a black dot on the end of it. I realize it's quite small. That black dot is a soapstone monolith that was placed in front of a wall. In the main complex, there's 5 of them, and it's thought that these were indicating important locations of the settlement. So there's one situated very far away from the main occupation area, and we don't quite know what that's all about. So there's certainly a lot of interest in these areas. There's going to be domestic activities, consumption, foodways, food preparation, possibly metalworking, and the production of ceramics, or the use of ceramics, them breaking and being discarded in very convenient places for archaeologists, such as the Middens I was talking about earlier. And so much of what we can know about Thulamela is still waiting on this 9-hectare expanse of the site. We have only touched just a small little area. And as I mentioned, from what we've touched, we haven't really done much with it. So here's a close-up of this primary occupation area. I prefer not to use the term Musonda just because it attaches certain cultural values to it. And can't be entirely certain just yet exactly, who this associates with. But so I just call it the primary occupation area. And that's purely because there's a number of enclosures here and several platforms that are possibly huts. So if you look down at the largest red circle, there's two squares there. Well, there's several squares there, 2A, B, C, D, 3A, 3B, 5A. This is the large midden that was excavated in 1990 by the National Museum. And this is where the first gold was found at Thulamela. So when Sidney Miller began excavating the site, they continued excavating this particular area. And they expanded upon the previous excavations led by Udo Kussel from the National Museum. There was also another excavation slightly above that. You can see it's labeled 4A. It goes into enclosure 6. So the letters and numbers E1, E2, the E stands for enclosure. And you can see there's 15 enclosures with the 16th one on the outside and the 17th one to the north. So that amazingly was excavated also in the early 1990s by the University of Pretoria as a practice excavation for students. And so I find that, on the one hand, it's interesting that students were taken to the site to practice their excavation skills, but it's quite sad because none of that has been published. None of the material was ever analyzed. Unfortunately, in that area, and possibly why the material wasn't analyzed, there's a lot of tree root action, and that's disturbed much of the archaeology, unfortunately. But that's true for large parts of the site as well. And then the last excavation that was taking place is 6A. That's at the bottom of the site. It's just outside the wall, right on the edge of the cliff. And the excavation there, the idea was also to remove the walling and excavate down to see what was there. So they actually excavated through the wall as part of the excavations. Then this large area, which is gridded out, called brush excavations. This is what Sydney called it. In that particular region, in E1 and E2, they noticed some hut floors, but they were very crumbly and very difficult to excavate. So when you worked with them, they broke apart very quickly and ultimately were destroyed before anyone could do any work. And so what they decided rather to do was to brush up very gently this entire area. So it's a 40 by 40 meter area with 5 by 5 meter squares that they brushed up. And they put all of this, everything they brushed up and excavated, they put through what Sydney called the yellow machine. And the yellow machine was an ingenious device that Sydney designed himself, which is essentially a Russian doll of barrel-like sieves. So if you imagine a 25-liter drum, except that it's not like a paint drum, but without the plastic, it's got a screen, a sieve screen around it. The innermost sieve screen is 2 millimeters in diameter. The next sieve screen was 10 millimeters. The next one was 25 millimeters. And so he ultimately was able to separate everything out into 4 different size classes. And then they got redirected through the other end of the sieve into different buckets. So it was a really genius idea. I just put one big sieve over a smaller sieve and shake it. But this is a true engineer shining through and coming up with a pretty nifty idea of how to solve this in a very efficient way. All right, so this is where the excavations took place. But as I mentioned, not much of this has been analyzed. Some of these stratigraphic profiles have been presented in the papers by Stain and so on, but many of it hasn't. So here you can see some of the excavation profiles on the left. I'm not going to talk much about this. On the left, this is from the midden. They excavated through a walled area where they found the wall was placed on top of a foundation that was below the surface. So you can see the size of that foundation, and then the wall more or less in the center. And they found in these various areas an incredible collection of ceramics. Some of these have been rebuilt. These are photographs from that were taken at the Ditsong Museum there were multiple images that I just turned into a GIF/GIF, however it's pronounced. And then, so you can just see the rotation and the various different shapes and sizes. But these are really impressive ceramics. These particular vessels were found in the enclosures where the human remains were found. Here are some of Sydney's drawings. Now, although none of this has really been presented and analyzed, Sydney's archive is spectacular. He drew an incredible amount of artifacts. We fortunately have all of this now here at the University of Mpumalanga. We've digitized this. We're in the process of digitizing. It's all been scanned, but now we want to redraw a lot of it. We've digitized this, and we'll be slowly going through his archives. So here you can see some more ceramics. On the next slide, you'll see what he called zoomorphic ceramics. These were all found crushed, unfortunately, but in enclosure 5, where UP43, the female burial, was found. Sorry, this is from the wall of enclosure 10, not 5, and the left one is from enclosure 14, where UP44 was found. So these he called zoomorphic ceramics, which he said are basically animal figures, but as pots. And hopefully we'll see these at some stage and see how exactly they're pieced together to look like animals. What was also found was a large amount of spindle whorls. Now, spindle whorls are quite interesting. These are used, so this is often just a broken ceramic shard, as you can see being held up on the left-hand side of your screen, with a hole bored through the middle and then rounded. And this is used for spinning cotton. On the site, they found 88 of these. It's a decent number of spindle whorls, and I'm sure there's many more. And again, this has only been around the primary occupation, so who knows what is happening away from that main settlement area. But they found 88 of these, indicating cotton spinning was taking place on site, which goes hand in hand with the kind of occupation of this, or the trade and exchange that's going on. So this over here is enclosure 13. Now, in this enclosure, they found some gold foil, as you can see in the image. They found arrows as well. And this is what Sydney thought to be receiving enclosure. So if you were to visit the king or the chief, you would probably enter this enclosure. Now, this is all based on vendor ethnography. You would enter this enclosure where you'd be received inside of a hut. The chief himself would have been residing in an enclosure neighboring this one, slightly to the left in this image. And he would have entered from a different entrance and seen you in this hut. Again, this is coming from vendor ethnography. And this is the first area where they did some serious excavation. So they exposed this entire hut structure, because this is one of the huts that wasn't crumbling apart, wasn't breaking away. This over here is enclosure 5. Now, this is the human remains. This is UP43, the female. This is the indentation that was seen inside the floor. So here is a profile image of that where you can see the indentation and UP43. The burial was about 400 mils below the surface. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure how quickly it was found on the surface or how much excavations was taken before it was spotted, because, 40 centimeters, 400 mils below the surface is quite a distance for an archaeologist. So, but it was somehow spotted. Here, this is an image that there is permission to use this image from the Thulamela committee. So you can see the burial on the bottom right with the gold bangle around the right arm marked with the number 3. There's an artistic rendering at the top and some images of the gold on the wrist, on the top left, and then once it had been removed from the wrist. And there was a second gold bangle with the burial as well. There's also a selection of ceramics that were found and iron hose in this particular enclosure. And then UP44. So UP44 is the other burial. This was found when the anatomy department was excavating UP43. It was also found below a hut floor. So here you can see a profile drawing with the hut floor. However, this was different. It didn't have the indentation. And what's fascinating about this burial is, unlike the female, which was in kind of a very typical burial posture, the fetal position, Sydney referred to the Lucia position. This one, the bones were bundled together. So here you can see how the bones are not articulated like in the previous image. They're bundled together, they were possibly in a cow or animal skin. They were possibly tied up together, and placed on top of them was this collection of gold. And here are some images of the gold that came out of UP44. And why it's so interesting, or partly why it's so interesting, is because these finds, or these remains have about 130, 140-year gap between them. So the male died around about the mid 1400s, okay, and the female died somewhere in the very late 1500s. However, what's really fascinating is this. So this whole talk is what the sort of narrative is that the female lived in Thulamela. died in Thulamela and was buried in Thulamela, and was buried as a complete body, which decayed, and then the hut floor slumped. But the male was brought to Thulamela. Only his bones came with him, and he was placed into the hut of what is thought to be the king, buried below the floor. The hut floor was re-established. It never slumped because the bones were already exposed. The body had already been decayed. And so it came from a previous occupation. But now what's quite interesting, we've obviously advanced our calibration curves. We are able to recalibrate a lot of the dates. And I recalibrated all of the dates for Thulamela to see how they came up. And interestingly, the dates actually overlap. They have a small overlap of about 20 to 30 years. So it's still possible that the burials, the two individuals were not alive at the same time. But with the new calibrated dates, that gap doesn't exist anymore. There is now a 20 to 30 year overlap. And so it's actually very possible that both the humans lived at the site at the same time, based on the recalibrated results. The gold is quite interesting as well. These are, this is gold, slag on the left-hand side with a little bit of gold residue in it. And on the right-hand side is a stone implement with gold flecks on it. There's also ceramic with gold flecks in it as well. And so there's a good chance that gold was being processed in Thulamela or near to it. And then I just want to show you two more slides of some of the artifacts. This is quite an unusual find that was made in the King's enclosure. So this is where UP44 was found, presumed to be the King's enclosure. This is a gong. So it's a metal gong. That's what it looks like presently. It's in a plaster of Paris, still in the deposit because it's incredibly fragile. And so this is a double gong, and you do see them in other parts of Africa. They're not very common at all. And it was the only place it's been found, or the only location was found at Thulamela was in enclosure 14, where UP44 was found. Sorry. But there is a large metal assemblage that came out of Thulamela. Here you can see on the left-hand column, the middle image is I should have just put these together, but I guess it's keeping you on your toes. But the left-hand image and then the bottom right image are both iron hose. The middle column, the top and the bottom images are arrows or spearheads. The top left image and then the right-hand column in the middle are metal wires and bangles, necklaces. It would have been probably used in some form like that. And the top right is a metal, what's probably a sweat scraper. The arrow in the middle at the top is quite well known. You may have seen images of it before. And this was interpreted by Sidney Miller as a hippo harpoon. Why exactly hippo harpoon, I'm not entirely clear, but it's pretty nasty. If you have a close look at it, that what looks like decoration in this image behind the arrowhead is actually barbs, metal barbs, and projecting in all kinds of directions. So I think whatever that spear pierced, it wasn't going to exit the body of that creature in much of a hurry. And so possibly if it was tied to a rope or of some kind, you would probably be able to spear something, but possibly a fish as well, and then reel it in. If it is a hippo, there's obviously a lot of danger involved in that too. So here's some photographs of some of the community work that's taken place at the site. There's an open air museum. And there is also here you can see offerings being made. This is inside the females enclosure, so UP43, where offerings are being made. That's what her burial looks like today. So a stone has now been placed there. There's packed rock in front of the stone. And here on the next image, on the top left, you can see the same individuals making an offering at the male burial. So that's in enclosure 14. The top right image is the excavations in enclosure 13. So this is the receiving enclosure for the king, perhaps. And there, the community was involved and were being shown around by an archaeologist. This is a photograph from the 90s when the archaeological team was showing members of the community what they were excavating. And the bottom right are some artifacts that you can find at the site. So Thulamela, it exists in this incredible landscape. It's an absolutely stunning landscape. Here, this footage, I hope it plays, and might be a bit jumpy, but I hope it does sort of play, and it's kind of interesting to look at. This is butchered from the documentary that was released recently. This is part of the Lavuvu River floodplain, the Fever Tree Forest. It's part of this really remarkable place. Our survey work in this area has shown us that most of these hills in that floodplain have Stone Age occupations through till at least the Makuleke were living in the region. And it's quite a special place from a trade point of view because of the convergence of these different rivers, the Lavuvu and the Limpopo. And so, for example, right by the confluence is a really large site that was probably occupied about 1,000 to 800 years ago. It's what we'd call a K2 settlement. And it's very possible that a site like that was occupied for the purpose of trade and exchange that was taking place in this region. Our interest in this landscape primarily comes from the fact that, as I've mentioned a number of times, very little work has actually been done after the initial spate of studies. There was some attempts at doing 3D scanning on the site by Lynn Meskel. And unfortunately, the team doing the 3D scanning didn't complete the work. And Lynn Meskel did write a book on heritage in Kruger National Park, one of the chapters on Thulamela, in which she recognizes a number of issues that took place at Thulamela and the sort of failings largely of the research that was conducted here. So our interest stem out of this sort of lack of work that was done at this incredible site that is perched on this amazing landscape. Where the site is located specifically, it's at the very exit, or depending which way you see it, but at the exit of this craggy, rocky, sandstone, hilly region, which is difficult to walk through, as you saw in that one image. Thulamela is at the very end of it, as the landscape opens up into this incredible floodplain, rich with wildlife, rich with grazing grounds and resources. And obviously, that river and the Limpopo River connecting all the way through to the East African coastline. So it's in a really sort of perfect part of this landscape if you were going to settle, if you were going to establish an important political center somewhere. This is just some images as you appear on top of the site. So what we'd like to do, or what we're busy doing, is revisiting Thulamela, looking back on this incredible settlement and asking a number of questions, primarily what is the historiography of this landscape? How do these sites tie in together? How did this site connect to these global networks that were infiltrating their way through Central Southern Africa during this period in time? I haven't mentioned the chronology very much, but or at all actually, but this site was occupied around about the mid-20th century. So from at least the 1400s when it started to peak until the late 1600s probably. But there is Mapungubwe ceramics on the hill. So it possibly has a Mapungubwe period occupation as well. So it's a really interesting period in time. It's a time when polities were certainly fracturing, and after Great Zimbabwe, you have the appearance of a number of main important centers, Thulamela being one of them, Kami, Danangombwe being others. But until that point in time, the main argument is that political power had been centralized at places like Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe, and then it fractured into these other political centers. What I find also fascinating about Thulamela is that its occupation stretches well into the colonial period, when you had Portuguese and you had Arab traders moving up and down the east coast, trading with the occupants of Thulamela based on the chronology of the site. So we're hoping to really open up the site, well, in ways that hasn't really been done so far. The first step is looking at the history, and that's something that Peter Delius and Linnell Chewins are doing, and hopefully there'll be a publication soon in that regard. But what we're also doing at the end of this month, I'll be traveling down to Pretoria to collect the assemblage that was excavated from Thulamela, and that's where we're going to begin our archaeological investigations. We're going to start with what's already been done at the site, partly and actually largely because we don't want to go up there and just excavate for the sake of excavating. We'd like to begin with what has been excavated and publish that and get it out into the public and into the scientific community so that it can be digested and it can be used, and it can be used to verify a lot of the claims that have been made about Thulamela. What we're also busy doing is walking this landscape. We've spent about 2 weeks so far, so it's not a lot of time walking this area, visiting a number of sites that are known, and fortunately also finding a few sites that haven't been recorded. And this is a lot of fun, I must admit. I quite like it. So getting out there into the bush, walking on these, between these baobab trees, through some of these riverine landscapes, which are stunning, hopefully continuing to dodge some of the elephants and the lions and so on that sort of present themselves every now and then when you don't expect them, leopards as well. And it's really a lot of fun, to be very honest with you. And our work is focusing on surveying this landscape, revisiting the collection that has already been excavated, and looking at this from a historic perspective. Depending on the finds, depending on what we can and can't say after we've done this, we would like to revisit Thulamela from an excavation point of view. Maybe we answer all of our questions, and that would be fantastic, that we don't need to come back up on this hill other than just to go and enjoy the beautiful site that it is. But I suspect that we will have questions. On the one hand, I know already chronology is an issue. There's a lot of jumbled chronology at the site, which sort of ruffles our feathers as archaeologists. When you have, an old date followed by a younger date followed by an older date again, that shouldn't happen, and that's happened at several locations at the site. So that's concerning. And we'd need to revisit the site from an excavation point of view to resolve that, I suspect. But if we don't need to excavate, we won't, although I think it possibly will happen. If we excavate the site, it will obviously be with intense consultations with communities, with stakeholders, with Sandparks, with SARA, ensuring that we do everything correctly to the best of our abilities and knowledge, so that we don't, put our foot in it every time we walk around another corner. So yeah, in the coming years, hopefully we'll be releasing a lot more and more. In the coming months, we'll begin analyzing a lot of the finds from Thulamela, trying to figure out, what the ceramic sequence is. What maybe if we can get better chronology, we will. Looking at some of the worked bone assemblage, which hasn't been investigated in any detail really, and looking at a lot of the metal, the golden remains, such as the ceramics and so on. So yeah, kind of. It's a cliche, but sort of watch the space. More will hopefully come of our work. If it doesn't, then unfortunately we aren't doing our job. But I don't think it'll come to that. We have a really lovely team of archaeologists and historians, and we have some ecologists coming on board as well. And so it's going to be a really dynamic project, I hope, with a lot of different factors playing into it, a lot of different studies. So it should be quite exciting to follow on. But we will send notices as things unfold. Just to end off, though, I would like to just thank you all for attending. Thank the Archaeology Society of the Western Cape for having me. I'm very happily sitting in some very warm weather up here. I hope it's warm where you are as well. I doubt it somehow, but it is just, it's very comfortable here. So I'm quite happy to be sitting behind my computer. But I'd like to just recognize or acknowledge the support that South African National Parks has given us, National Research Foundation, the University of Mpumalanga. I think probably seeing that logo there might surprise a lot of people who don't know about the university. It's a very young university. We're only 10 years old. We are trying our best to grow. We are growing quite rapidly. It's very exciting in the Lowveld to be part of this university. So hopefully also in years to come, this university will become something that you'll see more and more often in various different areas. I'd also just like to thank Richard Sari, Peter Delius, Lynelle Chewins, Jaco van der Spey, and Sean Blackburn for all of their assistance so far on the project. Thank you very much. And if you do have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. I found that very, very interesting. And I hope you do manage to actually see your pulse fishing owl at some point. And yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording now. And then if anyone would like to ask questions, they're welcome to turn on their cameras and microphones, or maybe put their hand up, so we don't all talk over each other. But I will keep an eye on those hands. But yeah, thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. It was a really interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Patricia.